Hey everyone, I'm Clive,
And I'm Louie.
and today we're going to be talking about BIM execution planning. It's the BEPs 101, and it's episode 2 in the series of BIM management webinars. So welcome everyone. We look forward to sharing with you today on the agenda why we even need a BIM execution plan. That's number 1.
And what to include in your BIM execution plan is number 2.
And how do we get teams engaged, and how do they get agreement to a BIM execution plan?
And then we'll touch a little bit on how to continuously improve on that. So everything that's worked really successful in your project, how can you make that and carry that over to the next project?
Ridiculously successful. So the first one we'll chat about now is why. Why do we need? Why do we need a BIM execution plan, Louis?
Great question. Great question.
Well, what happens if you don't plan? If you don't plan, we can have a lot of confusion and then a lot of blame, a lot of finger pointing. It was his fault.
Yeah.
He didn't plan that. Well, it wasn't me.
That happens with any task. And now imagine a big task like a BIM project and multiple teams on that project.
Yep.
You might experience a lot of confusion and blame.
And we see, this is some statistics here from PMI. They say that mostly the reason for failure on a project is poor communication, insufficient resource planning, unrealistic expectations. They're the top 3. And they're all related to things that we can plan for. So if we can put planning in place first, we get the opportunity to solve some of these challenges.
Yeah, and I've personally been on a couple projects where I wasn't involved in the BIM execution plan. It was just handed it was just handed to us.
Easy for you to say.
And yeah, it just starts off on the wrong foot.
So we looked into something called project maturity levels, and what we find a lot of the time when we start with just ad hoc and not formal standardized processes and sporadic reporting is that's exactly what happens. There's a lot of confusion, a lot of blame. And so we looked into, and we tie this to the lean philosophy of plan, do, check, and act. The second level in the maturity process is being planned. You start to have some kind of operational standard, but it's inconsistently managed. And then the third level, when you've got a plan and you start actually doing it, carrying it out, you were in the managed level. And you have organizational standards, but they're irregularly followed. And then as we go through and we start to integrate those into our workflow, we start checking and we start to have metrics in place, and we start to understand the performance across a company. And then the final phase there, when you start to really hit that continuous improvement cycle, is when you start to act on that. So when you have sustained performance and you evaluate your decisions based on past performance so that you can influence your future decisions. And that's really what we're trying to get to. So not just following an ad hoc, not formal standard, and being able to really put something in place that can be continuously improved.
Right.
But what are we planning?
Yeah, that's a good
question. We're doing BIM. We've just talked a whole load of project management speak, but what are we really planning?
What are we planning for?
Well,
so with BIM, there's a lot of uses, but to really align your uses, you've got to eliminate some of the risk.
BIM's great at that.
Identify what the risk on the projects are.
Yep.
For example, you might want to use coordination for a building that has a very complex design. That's one of the most common uses is for coordination.
Yep. You might want better quantities so you can get more accurate costing.
Or maybe facilities requires a lot of information for asset information. So that is a BIM use as well. So aligning those expectations and aligning what those uses are from the very beginning would really help you with the following steps to create this BIM execution plan.
Yep, eliminate risk. How do you find those things? And then these are some of the models that could be associated with those uses that would allow teams to eliminate a lot of that risk.
Some of these are some examples of a typical project life cycle, so all the way from design to construction and coordination, all the way to facilities. So really figure out where you are in the process. So sometimes you're coming in halfway through the design process or just getting into construction. So align those expectations with a client, with a team member right away, and you'll definitely start on the right foot.
Yeah, absolutely. So because you can use BIM for so many things, let's use it for everything. Yeah? Why not? Why not?
Well, like we mentioned earlier, you might have already missed out on some opportunities early in design, and depending on where you are, but you still might receive some
some very broad requirements.
contract
This,
terms here.
this is an example of some requirements that an owner might, if they're not so informed, ask for. And this is the equivalent if you're asking for LOD 400 plus Kobe, completely
Yeah,
undefined and impossible to deliver. But what they're really asking for is good, fast, and cheap all at the same time.
one of the things that I'd like to mention here is who's involved when you agree on this. Sometimes you have a project manager that says, yeah, we've got a BIM guy, they'll do that. Really, if there is BIM involved, make sure you understand what LOD 400 is or what Kobe data is. That'll really help you out.
So you can't have all three. Yeah, I think a lot of people would know this this sign, good, fast, and cheap. You can pick two of them. You can have good and cheap, but you can't have it fast.
Right.
You can have fast and good, but you can't have that cheap. And you can have cheap and fast, but you can't have that good. So that's why we need an execution plan, in order to be able to align expectations. But what do we need to include? Once we have identified those BIM uses, what do we need to include in the BIM execution plan? Should we talk about that?
Let's do it.
So here are a number of those, starting with an introduction, why we are really doing the project and what the goals are on the project, and understanding those uses and the processes in order to be able to achieve them, going right the way through to the scope. Let's take a look and a deeper dive into some of these.
Yeah, a typical BIM execution plan would have anything from project information, the contact team list, details, even links to other web application, or just sharing where all of the files or models are stored.
Yep. And introductions we mentioned there, but they could be different for each and every project that you work on. Some projects might need to have a very robust mission statement and a definition of why we are even starting to adopt BIM. Some might be slightly further along. It might be more training related introductions, and others might be much more detailed into the processes and understanding how they're going to deliver. Not wanting to cram the wrong set of information and introductions to the wrong teams. And then we need to define what the BIM uses are. So why are we doing this? If we're coordinating, what's the value that we're looking to achieve? The 40 phase schedule, why are we doing that? Why are we cost estimating? Why are we getting these quantities? Let's identify the customer and the reason why they're about to do it.
There are many uses that you can, as we mentioned a little while ago, but align with your own team what your services are, what your possibilities are as well. So aligning that with the client will align expectations on those BIM uses right away.
And then which processes do you need in order to achieve those BIM uses? Is there a flow diagram that requires a step-by-step explanation about how you're going to run a coordination workflow, for example? And then we look at standards.
Yeah.
Are you following the ISO standards? So ISO 19650, are you looking at being able to define, for example, the same terminology so that everyone is on the same page? We highly recommend that you do that. What is an asset information model, and how is that driven? What are the connections? How do you go through scoping that and finding out what informs it?
Yeah.
Who are the parties that are involved and why?
And for someone who's managed multiple models, receiving multiple models from other companies, different team members, standardizing them helps so much, because you're combining them into one platform for coordination. So the naming of the equipment, the piping, just all the way down to the naming of the files would extremely help. So standardize
keeping everyone on the same page, so you know where to find things. And then on the technology side, how are you going to support that? Are you going to have interactive workspaces? Are you going to recommend certain hardware, computers, whether it's iPads, etc.? And then the software versions, so that everyone can stay in touch. And it's more a recommendation to align rather than to mandate, depending on how you're working.
Right.
And then deliverables, how do you define your information requirements and your handover and essentially the format that you are looking for?
Yeah.
We recommend open BIM standards and IFC as a transfer mechanism, as a file transfer. There are other requirements that people do put into contracts as well. And we would just say that it's needing to be a contract. So on the right-hand side there, we're talking about adding a signature block so that we can actually get people's buy-in, contractual buy-in. And we'll talk about other buy-in later. And then
Scope. Yeah,
probably
definitely.
the most important part
Definitely the
of a BIM
most,
execution.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely the most important part of a BIM execution plan is the scope. You want to align what scope is required, who's responsible, how much information, and again, why are we doing BIM? What are those BIM uses? So aligning a really clear scope plan can help everyone.
So that's talking about why we need an execution plan and what is included. But how do you get your team engaged? How do you get that team to start looking and being part of that process? Should we take a look?
Yeah.
This is the common workflow. Common workflow would be to create a file, potentially a PDF file, email that to a team, try to collect feedback. And we see a lot of challenges in that workflow. And it usually leads to large documents. It's a time-consuming process, and to try to get that feedback. And we hear a lot about teams not really adopting and being potentially more confused.
Yeah.
So when you ask what happened to, or what happens to the BIM execution plan, did you get that email I sent? Did you get that file I sent by email?
No, I didn't.
No. It's
So
very easy to ignore something that's...
even if they admit that they did see it, we kind of get the most common answer that they didn't read it or understand it, or it was just too long. They didn't know what their scope was. So there's a lot of excuses and a lot of excuses that we get, but really, how do we engage them to actually look at it? There's a lot of useful information. How do we get them to view that?
So how do we...
How do
Do you know these slides? How do we engage the team? How do we do that? Well, few tips.
Yeah, create a central hub. So as we mentioned earlier, project information, contact details, and all.
How do you get access to those files
Yeah.
that everyone needs on that specific project? So rather than storing sets of links and everything in lots of different places, keep it together, make it easy for teams to find other contact details, for example, and let them keep those contact details up to date rather than you having to manage other people's contact details. How about making it simple? How about using a workflow and a diagram and being able to visualize those standards and those processes, making it a lot more attractive for people to get into?
Engage your team. So being able to get that feedback, having
And create it together.
yeah, create it together. So if you can create that
This is
together, it
Jenny
feels
and Ronnie.
it feels less mandated and feels more of a team effort
Danny,
to
Ronnie,
create a
Jenny,
BIM
Robbie.
execution plan.
I love it. What a good team. Use video content. Better than a whole 5-page set of text that potentially somebody is not going to read.
Yeah, sometimes you can really save a ton of pages and paper if you use videos. So we see a lot of successful teams using a 1-minute, 2-minute video on how to model something in Revit, how to coordinate something, or use a clash detection in Navisworks. If you can do that in a 1-minute, 2-minute video, it's so much more clear than having to write a set of instructions out in 6 pages.
And people will actually watch it.
Yes.
And then use rich content in flowcharts and embed them so they're interactive so that people can actually view them
Right.
without having to say, I can't read that, it's too grainy. You can embed the live files and even have interactive model walkthroughs as built. This is an example from Matterport being embedded into a BIM execution plan.
Yeah, instead of sending that email somewhere, put it inside that your BIM execution plan. People will start to engage and actually look at it.
Absolutely. So we've talked about why we need one, what we would include, and what engaging content that we would include in there.
Right.
But even if we've got one and it's got some nice pretty pictures in, how do we actually get agreement? How do we get people to follow along that workflow and give the thumbs up? Well, some of the challenges that we see in attaining that agreement, they start with the way that documents are created in a very isolated form. It's difficult to get that buy-in because it's a single file in a single place most of the time.
And usually the feedback, so once that person does create that, they send it to 10 people on the team, have to wait to get that feedback, gather that feedback, update the content, and because it's a large document, because there's so much to provide, it takes time to get and
A big bottleneck, yeah.
Which then ends up bottlenecking into either when that feedback is received or when it has to get shared again. So those are some of the challenges.
So we see the best results when you take bite-sized releases of information. Taking a section of a document and publishing that or sharing it, allowing a viewer to be able to see that, and only seeing and controlling the amount that you want them to see. And that would give somebody that was just reviewing your workflow enough of the document to be able to comment, and comment precisely on that section rather than have to review 100 pages in a PDF that was sent via email.
Yes, it simply becomes more of a comment like you would in social media. If you can just leave a sentence or two, provide that feedback, and then get notified right away of what that feedback is. Updates become now in minutes and not days.
And then having the best of both worlds. So to get agreement, we can't just have a live document because there's a fear that it's always going to be changing. But there is certain aspect of BIM execution plans that develop over time. There are certain aspects that mean that we do still want to get the benefit of having a live document. But being able to archive it as a PDF and lock it down and either lock or share the link with others is a really also an imperative, really important part of that workflow. So we talked about why, we talked about
what to include, how to engage your team to help you create that document, and how to actually get agreement from everyone on the team. So now,
let's talk about how to continuously improve it.
Let's do it. Well, let's just copy it from the last project.
That would be evil.
What? It's the fastest way.
Duplicating a file can seem the easiest way to get to a starting point, and we completely understand that. But usually what that does, and this is just a list of a few of those challenges, copy and paste being one of them, but copying and pasting can carry those unrealistic expectations into another project. Potentially, copy and paste is going to cause a lot of problems downstream if it's not selective and if it's not done in a controlled way.
Yeah, think about all of the project-specific information that you just copied over, and now it's a lot of administration burden to read through all of that and pinpoint what is relevant for this project and what isn't.
So just a few challenges, but the implication of those challenges, it's not lean. We talk about implementing bite-sized workflow to be able to be lean, but those unlean workflows that create bottlenecks, create misunderstandings, the confusion and blame, the finger pointing, and a lot of liability, a lot of risk in that workflow. Yeah. So a few tips. How do we improve that?
Figure out what are the general information that you would use from project to project. What is consistent on every project, and make those templates. And then at that point, you save a lot of time when you create that new BIM execution plan, but now you're just plugging in project-specific information. But also involving your team. So if something doesn't make sense in your workflow because other team members aren't so happy with it, listen, what is it that would make their workflow more efficient? Not just mandating a certain workflow because you read it somewhere, but figuring out what is right for your company. But then also gathering all that information. So you might use multiple documents and platforms, but putting all of that in a single location would really help you templatize this and keeping those updated amongst the team all together. So those of you who are in big companies, multiple offices, you want to have that one template that you can go to and update.
For each project type as well, or each region and each project type. Managing those templates and getting buy-in from everyone, but keeping them in a single place so they can continuously improve, making it easy to update them. Yeah. And creating competitive advantage. So how do you become that level 5, that sustained, being able to use lessons learned and create best practices and that continuously improving loop? How do you do that? How do you evaluate your future decisions based on that past performance? And I think that a few of those tips that Louis just shared really do help us to get to awesome.
Awesome.
So in conclusion, we have just shared a few insights into improving the BIM execution planning workflow. The first one was really understanding why we're doing BIM in the first place. So really understanding what those BIM uses are that are tied to the risk that the client or parts of the customer in that supply chain are trying to achieve, trying to combat.
Right, and then that's going to help you tie all of your BIM uses. So when you identify the why, you then share, not just for yourself, but for everyone involved, why we're doing BIM in the first place. and then that's going to lead you into a perfect scope, a lean scope, so everyone knowing why they're actually modeling to a certain level of geometry or why they're adding that sort of information. It's less questions, more efficient. Templates. Create those templates, save a lot of time when you go from one project to another. They're easier to update than having to update something that you copied from another project.
Yep.
And adding that rich content. So sometimes those flow charts, those that the flow charts or videos, sometimes those are easier to update from project to project, instead of having to search for it in a long Word file.
Absolutely. Yeah, and having a continuous release cycle so you can continually review with the project team and then also feed that back to your standards team as well so you can continue to improve the templates in your company.